Good afternoon. How is everyone? Very good, very good. Well, it is my pleasure. My name is Andy Karfa. I'm the Dean for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Fredonia. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 43rd Robert W. Kasling Memorial Lecture. And at this event, we will obviously hear from the Kasling Lecture from 2020, and also the Hagen Award winner for 2020. To get things started, I'm pleased to welcome President Stephen Collison to the podium to give us some welcoming remarks.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can, I think you can hear me back there. Okay, great. So, when I was a very young person growing up in Liberia, there was a TV program that I used to like to watch. I'm sure you will all recognize what it is, or most of you will recognize what it is, because I'm going to read the introductory statement from that television show. And it's not trivia, but when I'm through, you can, if you know the show, you can also just tell me what you think it is. But this is what it said. It says, space, the last frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission to seek out new life and civilizations, to boldly go where no one has gone before. Anybody remember that? Great. Star Trek. It was one of my favorite television shows. But what is the relevance of that with our purpose of being here today? Let me emphasize 2 lines from that introduction. To seek out new life and civilization. To me, that is about discovery. To boldly go where no one has gone before. Research, creativity, new knowledge. So let me suggest that this is the relevance to our purpose of being here, because this introduction of this movie was about discovery, scholarship, recognizing and celebrating excellence in discovering and in creating. The Kasling Memorial Lecture and the Hagen Young Scholar Award are celebrations of recognition of excellence in research, creativity, artistic performance. The recognition and celebration of exceptional scholarship. To boldly go where no one has gone before. To discover, to create what no one has discovered or what no one has created. So then, why are these things important? Universities distinguish themselves through excellence in impacting knowledge and adding new knowledge to things that already exist. And the people who participate in these endeavors they do add relevance and prestige to the university they serve. To me, this is why we've taken the time to be here this afternoon. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to this memorial lecture, and I want to extend very special congratulations to Dr. Birger Vanwesenbeeck. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. and Dr. Michael Duham for their scholarship and bringing prestige to SUNY Fredonia. Thank you.
Thank you, President Collison. Just for the record, we've been watching Star Trek. We're starting with Enterprise and working our way through the timeline with our 9-year-old. So it's probably no surprise to many of you that he has no expectation of a normal childhood whatsoever. Anyhow, again, I want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming here. You know, for me as a dean, these sorts of events are really special to me. It's an opportunity to bring us together as a community and to celebrate the excellence that so many of us bring to this campus on a regular basis. It's easy for us to get to know folks and not necessarily know some of what they do, right, and how well known they are in their fields. And so this is a chance to share that. And so thank you again for taking the time. The first award that I have both the personal and professional honor to introduce is the William T. and Charlotte N. Hagen Young Scholar Artist Award. This award recognizes an individual who has made outstanding recent achievements in research or creativity. The award is named in honor of William T. Hagen, an eminent scholar specializing in the history of Native Americans. Arriving in 1965 and retiring in 1988, he served as History Department Chairperson and as Acting Vice President for Academic Affairs. He was awarded a SUNY Distinguished Professorship while here. Dr. Hagen is honored for his widely recognized distinguished scholarship and for personifying for Fredonia's faculty, scholarly activity, and his personal, high professional, and humane values. And I'm pleased to say that the person who received the 2020 Hagen Young Scholar Artist Award, I think, very much fits the description provided by that last sentence. And that is Dr. Michael Dunham. The annual award recognizes an individual who has made I'm repeating myself. I think you will agree, after giving you just a brief summary of his scholarship and other activities, that he is an obvious choice for this honor. Mike earned his PhD and master's, both in astronomy from the University of Texas at Austin, and a bachelor's degree in physics and astronomy from the University of Rochester. He joined the faculty here at Fredonia in fall of 2016. We were just talking about that. Prior to this, he served 3 years as a postdoctoral research associate at Yale University and 3 years as a submillimeter array postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. I trust you've heard a few of those names before. His research is focused on better understanding star and planet formation. And I'm going to quote from an article written by Roger Cota here. And that is, one of the major unsolved problems in stellar astrophysics is understanding why the distribution of stellar masses is invariant throughout the universe. And one of the key challenges to making progress in this area is the fact that we still don't fully understand why a single star forms with the mass it has. My research is focused on revealing how multiple physical processes come together to set the masses of stars. Hopefully you understand why I had to quote that. As one might predict about someone receiving this award, Mike is a leading researcher in his field. Specifically, he has co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed articles. I'm pausing for dramatic effect here. All right. He's obtained funding both internally and externally and shared his expertise by mentoring multiple students in research. By the way, since he came here to Fredonia, 44, I believe, of those articles were produced while here. Okay? In just the last year or two, because he moves quickly, so I'm estimating here, he has published 10 articles and served as the prime investigator on 3 international projects. So that's pretty impressive, right? I'm going to argue that this is not what makes him stand out the most, actually. No, it's Mike's work with students and his outreach efforts that are most notable because of this incredible research output. In fact, many of you in the room, many of people across campus probably better know Mike for his engagement and being at meeting after meeting for a variety of different things, as opposed to his incredible scholarship. For example, his work as part of the Digital Instruction Support Team, the DIS team. Right? For those of you who have been teaching remote, right, or this past so since our pivot to remote and then continuing to teach on remote, it was members of this team who really provided a great deal of support to keep folks going, to give them the expertise they needed to be so successful at it. I've had the pleasure of working with them on the Academic Technology Subcommittee, again, another group that was involved in trying to plan and stay at least half a step ahead of things as the rules changed constantly since the outbreak of COVID. And then he's created regular observatory nights, incorporating the observatory, the platform about the observatory, and the planetarium. In fact, I don't think Betty's here, so I can get away with saying this, but I don't think it's too much in saying that the observatory was recently named. And as many of you may or may not know, to name something means you've given a good chunk of money to do so. And so it's received a significant endowment, or we've received a significant endowment, and it's in part because of the story that the foundation could tell, and that's Mike's story. And at the risk of making him impossible for his department chair, and I verified this just minutes ago, I'm going to quote his chair, who I think is going to, hopefully, will then, what I'm about to say will support what I've said about him. So his chair, Justin Conroy, says, his caliber of research and productivity is at the level of an R1 university, which makes his dedication to student-centered teaching and community outreach that much more impressive. Again, still quoting his chair. I think hiring him will be the biggest legacy of my chairship. Now that's an endorsement. So it's clear, right? He deserves, more or less a little bit of recognition at this point. And I'm pleased that we're all able to do so today. So please join me in welcoming Mike to the stage and offering him a hearty round of applause. All right, next we have the Kasling Memorial Lecture. This is named for Robert W. Kasling, professor of geography at Fredonia from 1946 to 1966, who is remembered for unflinching personal integrity and a high standard of scholarship. In honor of the contribution which he made to the institution, SUNY Fredonia invites a distinguished member of the faculty, one whose scholarly excellence has enhanced the reputation of the university, to share with the entire Fredonia community an insight into the nature and significance of research or creative activity in his or her field. The lectures focused on explaining the methods, purposes, and results of a particular area of scholarship are intended to broaden the understanding of research being undertaken at Fredonia. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Birger Vanwesenbeeck for this lecture. Birger has a doctorate and master's both in comparative literature from the University of Buffalo and a bachelor's in Germanic language and linguistics from the University of Antwerp. Prior to joining Fredonia in 2007, Birger was an assistant professor of American literature at the University of Laval, Canada. I have had the pleasure of getting to know Birger's work by reviewing his materials for his promotion to associate professor and preparing introductory remarks when he was on this very stage receiving another award. Yes, if you've looked at your program carefully, you might note that Birger is one of only a handful of individuals who have received both this award and the Hagen Young Scholarship Award. In addition to these, he has received other honors, such as a Fulbright Senior Visiting Lecture position at a university in Istanbul, Turkey. What has always stood out to me about Birger's scholarship is both its breadth and its depth. With regard to the breadth of his work, as he describes it, quote, "It covers the whole gamut of literature and literary theory," unquote. And I can't disagree with that at all. Indeed, much of his work brings together what I consider somewhat disparate fields. For instance, one example is his use of psychoanalysis and critical social theory to examine ideas about art and mourning in the works of Joyce, Woolf, and Shakespeare. He has earned international recognition for much of his work, including postmodernist studies with a primary focus on Thomas Pynchon, if I remember correctly, and his tireless efforts associated with the work and life of Stefan Zweig. In fact, this February, he will be co-chairing together with a professor at Ghent University, a conference devoted to Zweig and Belgium that will be held at Ghent University, featuring many primary documents from Fredonia's own very large and comprehensive Zweig archive. As is always the case with a brief introduction like this, particularly since he wants me to talk less so he can talk more, I can only give you kind of, what I'm giving you obviously just scratches the surface, but to give you kind of a more 2,000-foot view, Birger is co-editor of 2 scholarly books, the author of 16 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, as well as over 30 book reviews in both English and Dutch. He is currently completing a monograph entitled Lost in Translation that looks at the concept of mourning across language. To add to this aforementioned breadth, the lecture that Birger is about to give focuses on a critical examination of the assumptions prevalent in African American studies. I'm going to quote again from Roger Coda, an article from Roger Coda, is that the assumptions, so these assumptions include the presumption that, number one, the presumption that to be free is to write and speak English, and that the idea of racism and racial identity are primarily matters of not seeing. And to quote Birger from that article, the goal of today's lecture is to upend both notions. And given what I've seen in his work, I have no doubt that he's about to do so this afternoon. So without further delay, since you are here to listen to Birger and not me, which shows really good judgment on your part, please help me welcome Birger to the stage to congratulate him and enjoy his lecture.
Thank you, Dean Carafa, for these very kind words, and thank you, President Carlson, for these nice welcome remarks. I'm going to try to keep an eye on the clock because I don't want to, keep you here longer than we need to be here. First of all, I also would like to thank my esteemed colleagues of the Kasling committee for selecting me for this award. This is really a great honor, and I'm humbled by this by this honor. I also would like to thank my wife Iji and my son Doa for the day-to-day support and for their love. And I also would like to thank my mother, who, if she managed to put the computer up, is probably watching this via the live stream. But also thank you to all of you for coming. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Birger Vanwesenbeeck, and I'm a proud member of the English department, have been since 2007. And a lot of my research, and also I should say my teaching, focuses on the relationship between language, literature, and loss. And I should perhaps tell you that this is for me both a scholarly endeavor, but it's also a personal one. Having grown up in Belgium, I did not grow up in a multilingual household, but I will say that I was exposed to many different languages from a very early age on. And I think that spurred me to think about what these different languages have to offer us when we think about ourselves, when we think about identity, but also when we think about losing. And so since I came to the United States, this was 20 years ago, for graduate studies, obviously these questions have continued to preoccupy me, which then shows itself in my work very often in that I tend to gravitate towards those writers. Stefan Zweig would be one example, but also many of the American writers that I write about. I tend to gravitate towards writers who have this same multilingual kind of mindset and who ask some of those questions. And I think that when it comes to American literature, the question of language and loss is actually posed nowhere more hauntingly, it seems to me, than in the corpus of African American writing. And that's what I want to talk about today for the next 40 minutes or so. We'll see how things go. So my lecture today is entitled African American Writing as World Literature. I think the first part of that title will be very obvious. Writing produced by people of African American descent. But the second part may need a little bit of elaboration. The term world literature was coined almost to the day, actually, 200 years ago by the German Romantic poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And he coins this term because he has been reading some non-Western authors, the Persian poet Hafez, and also some Chinese novels. And what Goethe is struck by is a certain kind of artistic kinship that he sees with these non-Western writers. A kinship not just with a European literary tradition that Goethe, who was a polyglot, was very familiar with, but also with his own writings. And this then in turn prompts him to what is essentially at that point in time a hypothesis, but it's this notion that writers, of course, never just steal from those within their own national tradition. They're always already crossing all kinds of boundaries and picking up from whatever they can find. So when Goethe coins the term Weltliteratur, world literature, that's the idea that he's trying to capture, that it is a mistake, it is an example of provincial thinking, if you wish, to try to conceive of literary traditions in narrow nationalistic terms. And now this is actually quite a revolutionary insight, not just because Goethe was the first one to really theorize about this, but we also have to remember the 19th century, among other things, is of course the great century of nationalism, right? So to think of a poet who is able to somehow step out of that nationalistic paradigm and to hypothesize about a realm that he called world literature is actually quite a revolutionary insight. Now, when we think about African American writing, it should seem, I think, obvious that that corpus is an obvious candidate for being considered within the paradigm of world literature. As the title itself suggests, African American writing is writing, yes, for the most part, but not exclusively, in English, but with a clearly felt or perceived tie to the African continent, right? So by its very definition, one would then suspect African American literature can only be made sense of within a global perspective. And yet what's stunning, or what stunned me when I sort of first started looking at the available scholarship on African American writing, is that to this day, it is almost exclusively considered within a narrow national American framework. This is actually true even, and some of my colleagues in the English department will notice, even if one looks at the remarkable revival that the concept of world literature has had in our field for the past 20 years, even there, what you see is scholars will write about European literature, they will write about South African novels. Very rarely will they write about African American literature. The implicit presumption still seems to be, and I find this quite incredible, still seems to be that African American writing can only be made sense of within that narrow national American context. African American literature is a kind of American literature, but it has no significance in any kind of global context. I think that's a mistake. So one of the things that I'm going to be, or one question that I will be exploring in this lecture today is, what would it mean, and actually that we should do so, what would it mean to think of African American literature as world literature in a global context? And then my second question, which perhaps is the more intriguing one, why is it that until now we continue to insist on this seemingly rather outdated national framework when it comes to African American literature? We actually don't do this with all forms of ethnic literature. Right? If you look at Asian American literature, it seems to me, far more of a global awareness. So if you lose the thread of my talk over the next few minutes, just keep in mind these are the two questions that will be guiding the talk. Right? What would African American writing as world literature, what would that look like? And secondly, why is it that we have not, and that's of course a political question, as you I think already may guess, why have we not explored African American writing in such a global context earlier? And I'm going to start this discussion, if you will indulge me, by talking a little bit about one of my favorite maps. I love maps, my students know this. This is the Linguistic Diversity Map of the world. If you want to look this up, this actually is from a New Scientist article of a while ago, popularizing Science magazine. Now, of course, we are traditionally, and this campus is no exception to that, I think traditionally we are very prone to think of diversity in terms of ethnic and racial terms. But I'm going to invite you for the next minute or so to think along the lines of what it means to define diversity in linguistic terms. So how does this work? Well, countries or regions are assigned a different color coding depending on how many different languages exist in that region. Now, what constitutes a language, let me also clear that up right away, is here defined, as it should be, linguistically, not politically. Right? So, of course, in some countries there may be only one official language, but that has, of course, not prevented people from speaking other languages too. Right? So the LDI, Linguistic Diversity Index, assigns a number between 0 and 1, where a score, if you like, of 0 means the hypothetical situation where everybody in that country speaks the same language. And a score of 1 would be, again, the theoretical situation where everyone speaks a different language. There's a couple, and I could actually make the whole lecture about this map. I'm going to try to sort of keep it short. I think it's endlessly fascinating. But very quickly, there are a couple of conclusions that one can already draw from this map. First of all, what the map shows is that one of those trite and crass jokes that Europeans still like to tell is not true. And the joke, maybe you know it's not a very good joke, says, What do we call a person who speaks 2 languages? A bilingual. What do we call a person who speaks 3 languages? A trilingual. What do we call a person who speaks 1 language? Anybody who knows this? An American. Well, look at this map. The United States is actually a fairly diverse country, if we think of diversity in linguistic terms. Not as diverse as Canada, right? So there are 364 different languages, right, where we live. I mean, the nation that is. But it's certainly a lot more diverse than some of those snobbish European countries. Right? It's more diverse than France, it's more diverse than England, it's more diverse than Scandinavia. Again, keep in mind we're defining languages here in linguistic terms, not political terms. One other thing I want to point out is it's actually also, the United States is actually, and this may also surprise you, I don't know, it's actually more diverse linguistically speaking than considerable parts of Latin America. Or more or less the same, and that actually also has a story to tell. It shows you that when the conquistadores came to the New World, they were clearly more successful in wiping out the Aztec, Inca, and Maya empires than were the people who orchestrated the Trail of Tears in North America. Right? Because even until today, as you can tell here by the map, there's a lot of Native American languages that are still being spoken. In fact, if you don't have to travel far. If you want to learn one of those, right, it's just the Seneca Reservation would be probably the closest place where one might learn such other languages. But what I really want to talk about, of course, is look at the continent of Africa. When it comes to linguistic diversity, and this is probably the case actually, sadly so, I would add, it's probably also the case when it comes to natural resources. There is not a single continent that comes closer to Africa in terms of its richness. Right? We're not very prone to hear the word richness in Africa put together in our media. Right? But when we talk about linguistic diversity, look, for instance, at the dark color shading of equatorial Africa. There's an incredible diversity of languages. In fact, as you heard President Carlson just say, the country of Liberia, where he grew up, most of the education probably takes place in English, but from what I was able to gather, there is at least 20 other different languages. Right? So I would imagine that as you grew up, President Carlson, that you also were surrounded by those many different languages. So we must presume then, I'm going to sort of backtrack now, because this is a contemporary map, I'm going to backtrack a good 300 years or so. I mean, we must presume that in the 17th century, when the slave trade gets underway, we must presume that already a lot of that linguistic diversity is in place. Which then, of course, brings up a very obvious and haunting question, doesn't it? What on earth happened to those native African languages that those who were enslaved brought with them to the Americas? Well, what happened to these languages? Well, as it turns out, that's not really a question, and I find this incredible, that has traditionally loomed very large in African American studies. We don't know how many of those languages there would have been, just as we do not have a precise number of how many people perished in the horrible experience of the Middle Passage. Right? Toni Morrison, if you've read Beloved, puts the counter at 60 million, but the sad fact of the matter is that we don't know this with great precision. But I like to refer to those lost languages, lost at least to a large extent, as the many dozens gone. As some of you may know, Many Thousands Gone is a title of a famous song that was sung by the enslaved on the plantation. It's also if you want to read up on that particular history of the United States, it's also the title of a great study of American slavery by by Ira Berlin. But the point is that the question of the many dozens gone does not loom, or has traditionally not loomed very large in African American studies. In fact, so much so that as late as 1993, Mark Schell, who's a professor emeritus of comparative literature at Harvard, that as late as 1993, he could refer to this history as the brutal phenomenon history of American slavery. Now, if you remember your Greco-Roman mythology, you will know that the story of Philomela, which among other places you might find in Ovid's Metamorphoses, tells the story of the girl Philomela who is raped by Tereus, but then on top of that, and this is the sort of graphic scene that you see depicted in a Renaissance woodcut representation of it, after the rape, he also cuts out her tongue so that she could not speak out about the trauma that has been done to her. You can see how that's indeed a compelling way for thinking about African American slavery, where then the rape is the process of enslavement, and then the languages which disappeared over a generation or two for the most part, the languages that were taken away is then Tereus also cutting out the tongue of Philomela. So the question for me then becomes, is it still possible? And as I will try to show you through 3 examples of what I think of as phenomenal African American writers, is it still possible to testify to the loss of those languages? And also here, the example of Philomela is instructive. I mean, it depends what version you read, but in the Ovid version, she eventually is able to tell the story of her rape by drawing it in the sand. Right? So also there, I think it's a very compelling metaphor, even if for, let's say, a contemporary African-American writer who can sort of date his ancestry back to Africa, even if you no longer have the many dozens gone at your disposal, what strategies might you nonetheless devise to register that element of loss even as you're writing in English? Right? To me, the most interesting writers of the African American tradition, Phyllis Wheatley, whom you have on the cover of your program, is one of those. To me, the most interesting writers are the writers who ask that linguistic question. But before we look at those strategies, I want to return to my second question. Okay, but why is it that what should be really a very obvious question, why has that question not loomed more large in African American studies, as we have known it for the past half century or so? Well, here I have to talk about 2 myths that I think each have done their share in preventing us, if you like, from asking that question of the many dozens gone. The first myth is what I like to call the myth of English as the great emancipator. Of course, the great emancipator, President Abraham Lincoln, bears that epithet, as many of you will know, because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which effectively manumitted all those who were enslaved in the United States at the time. But I want you to think of that notion in relationship to the English language. Because once you start looking, and this is actually both true for the scholarship on African American writers and for a lot of African American writers themselves, once you start looking at that corpus, one of the things that strikes you is that how often the English language is being presented as this exclusively hallowing presence. The best place to see that is the traditional slave narrative, such as the narrative of Frederick Douglass, which some of you may have read. The traditional slave narrative actually follows a fairly predictable pattern. It opens with a description of all the horrors of bondage. Then somehow, along the way, the enslaved becomes literate. Sometimes he or she has to hide this from the master. But the literacy, by which of course is meant English literacy, is then tied in one way to another to the liberation that is either accomplished through manumission or through the slave escaping, so that what you find in these slave narratives is that English is kind of held out, if you like, as the ultimate prize for the delivery from bondage. Which also explains, for instance, why the ultimate climax then of the slave narrative is not, the climax actually is not the journey to liberation. The climax comes when the formerly enslaved becomes a writer in his or her own right. And that's, of course, what we see in the narrative of Frederick Douglass. So what I find striking about this passage that you have on the projection is that, first of all, of course, the phenomenal persona of Douglass here is not in doubt, right? Neither is the remarkable artistic quality of this passage in doubt. But what I'm trying to make you see is the sort of ideological work that it does. So Douglass, in a beautiful passage that connects both the present act of writing to the past suffering as a slave, looks at the gashes, the scars on his body, and notices or has us think that they are in fact so profound that he can put his pen into them, right? As if the pen becomes, at least I think that's some of the suggestion that we have here, as if the pen in fact becomes like a balm that is put over the wound. Now, I think you can start to see if English is being held out as the great emancipator, then of course we do not have to worry so much about what happened to those other languages that once upon a time the enslaved brought with them to the Americas. So we have in fact a displacement, if you like, of that question onto a celebration of the liberating qualities of the English language. Now you may say, well, but does it really matter that it's English? Maybe it's just, the point is that it's just literacy. As we'll see in a minute, when I get to Phyllis Wheatley, we will see that indeed it does matter, that it's not just literacy as such. No, it needs to be English literacy. Now, a second example of this same logic, I would say, is the celebration of what linguists call AAVE, African American Vernacular English, or Black English, in short. Now, again, the point I'm trying to make is not to call into question either the aesthetic qualities, the beauty, or whether or not one should be speaking Black English. That's a different discussion, and that's obviously all fine for me. But the mythology creeps in once we start presuming that the dialectical variant of AAVE was somehow brought about and still carries within itself the remnants of those African languages now lost in time. That's actually an approach. Linguists call this the African substrate hypothesis. That's an approach that was very current in the 70s and 80s, which is actually not coincidentally, I would say, the time when there's a big push for celebrating AAVE. If you look at linguists, and it's not, I want to be fair, it's not everybody, some are still holding on to that substrate hypothesis, but most linguists actually have gone back on that and have pointed out that, again, linguistically speaking, AAVE, Black English, has no connection whatsoever, was not formed, as back in the 80s we still thought, was not formed by some kind of symbiotic clash between English and some African language. That symbiotic clash does exist in some places, right? I think this is precisely what makes the African American experience so inherently tragic. If you look at the variants of English or French or Dutch spoken by descendants of slaves in the Caribbean, yes, over there we absolutely have that clash. Right? Linguists call these creoles, and there we can in fact detect via analysis of syntax or vocabulary or any other linguistic elements, we can still detect that these are languages that were formed and that still carry the traces of those older African languages. It's the only place in the United States where that's also true is the Gula dialect, as it is still spoken today in coastal South Carolina and coastal Georgia. There we still have a creolized form of English. It sounds very different from what we call AAVE. And there one could say, yes, the black dialect carries within itself traces of the many dozens gone. But for AAVE, for Black English, by which we mean the variant of English as it is spoken in the, let's say, continental United States, there is no such historical tie, linguistically speaking. So it's again, it's continuing the mythography to think that that's a way back to the many dozens gone. The second myth, and usually these two myths go hand in hand. I'm going to take a look at the time here too. The second myth is, as you heard Dean Carafa already briefly mention, it's this notion that racial identity and racism too are primarily matters of not seeing. Again, I want to be very clear that the point is not to deny that not seeing, or what the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre would have called bad faith. The point is not to deny that bad faith plays a great role in sustaining racism. It absolutely does. But it's also not the entire story. And if we think it's the entire story, once again, what will elude us is the question of the many dozens gone. So I call this the invisibility paradigm. You find it in the work of Toni Morrison. I have here a little snippet from Playing the Dark, where that ends with, it requires hard work not to see this. The problem with racism is that it's right in front of the white person's face, but he or she chooses not to see it. Again, I'm not saying that that's not true. It's just not the whole story. Clearly, if you read Invisible Man, which uses the metaphor of a black protagonist who points out that people do not see him, we clearly see that same paradigm. If you've read Between the World and Me, I think Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I think is a phenomenal writer, but also commits that invisibility paradigm myth, I would say, in thinking that that's all there is to it. And this I just ran into Fenton Hall the other day. It's from a lecture that was given on campus, I think about a year ago. Notice also how racism is being reduced, if you like, to being a problem of not seeing. That's problematic because as long as we adhere exclusively to the invisibility paradigm, once again, the question of the many dozens gone will not appear. And there's a very simple reason why that's the case. I mean, language is, of course, not a matter of seeing. Language is a matter of sound. It's of hearing. So the way in which I would like to amend the invisibility paradigm is by not simply asking what remains invisible, and we all know a lot remains invisible when it comes to matters of race in this country, but also to ask the question, what can somehow not be heard? What would it mean to make the English language reverberate with whatever echoes we can still find of the linguistic toll that the Middle Passage enacted? And so I'm going to turn it over now to my three examples. And these are three writers that each of them do that. They are not oblivious to the invisibility paradigm either. I mean, I think they all probably point out that racism has to do with not seeing too. But they also highlight the question of the inaudible, if you like, when it comes to the history of African American experience and what it means to testify to that which can no longer be heard. So let's start with Phyllis Wheatley, who in many ways I think of as one of those continuously haunting personas in the history of American literature. Nowadays, it's very fashionable, right, to rally behind Phyllis Wheatley, whose significance, as many of you will know, is that in 1773, she became the first published African-American poet. But through times, we haven't always been so enthusiastic about Phyllis Wheatley. For instance, during the Harlem Renaissance, most black writers stayed away from her because they felt she did not offer enough personal evocations of what it meant to live under bondage. And I think she's haunting us still today, because even as we nearly universally celebrate her, I still think we are not fully getting at the true revolutionary potential of her work. So what's the story of Phyllis Wheatley? Well, this is actually from that original publication in 1773. This is a drawing that was actually made by another African-American artist. In 1761, Wheatley is abducted from the red region here, the coast of West Africa, a region that at the time was known as Senegambia. So it covers the region between the Senegal River and the Gambia River. So today the countries of Senegal, Mali, Gambia are to be found there. She's abducted from there, 1761. She's 10 years old. She's brought to Boston Harbor, where she is sold, auctioned off, and becomes the servant of the Wheatley household. Within that Wheatley household, she quickly shows a great propensity for learning the English language. She starts publishing poems. By 1773, she has enough of them so that a first volume can be published. By the way, that volume still is not published in the United States. Right? It seemed that even then we were not enlightened enough. It was published in Britain, and Wheatley actually traveled to London to witness the publication. But what I want to point out still about that map here is these colored regions refer not to different languages, refer to different language families. We do not know this with great certainty, but more likely than not, when Phyllis Wheatley is abducted from Senegambia, her native tongue would have been Fulani. Right? So the red area is an area where in the north Fulani would have been spoken at the time. But I want to focus, so this then explains, of course, the great fascination that we've had with Phyllis Wheatley ever since. Obviously, being the first published African-American poet is quite a title to be able to carry. But I want to focus on something else, and I want to invite you to read this with a grain of salt. 50 years, so that's half a century, after Wheatley's death, the great-grandniece of her owners, of Susanna Wheatley, published a memoir. The memoir is focused on Wheatley, who had continued posthumously to inspire people. And at some point in the memoir, Margareta Odell, as the great-grandniece was called, says the following about Wheatley, something that she remembers from when she was a young girl. She soon gave indications of uncommon intelligence and was frequently seen endeavoring to make letters upon the wall with a piece of chalk or charcoal. A daughter of Mrs. Wheatley, not long after the child's first introduction to the family, undertook to learn her to read and write, and while she astonished her instructress by her rapid progress, she won the goodwill of her kind mistress by her amiable disposition and the propriety of her behavior. What's striking about this passage is that this is Wheatley scribbling things on the walls of her owner's house, itself already kind of an act of rebellion or subversion, if you like. But she's doing this before she has even been instructed to learn English. So what is she writing? Is it conceivable that the 10-year-old, I mean, as if, of course, the experience of slavery itself is not horrific enough, but is it conceivable that the 10-year-old that was sold off at Boston Harbor in 1761, that she might already have been literate? So it's an incredible credible hypothesis to think about. We do not know this for sure, but many scholars now point out that it's possible because by the mid-18th century, the empire of Islam, the empire of Arabic, had already spread from the Middle East all the way to that part of Senegambia, where we now know Phyllis Wheatley would have been from. We also know that it was not inconceivable for girls to receive instruction in the Arabic language. Now, I want you to think about this, because if you're willing to contest my approach of English as the great emancipator, and you want to say, well, but it's not English, it is literacy, here we clearly encounter a situation, I think, where it seems to matter. If we want to link Phyllis Wheatley's freedom to literacy, right? For instance, Henry Louis Gates has a relatively new book about Phyllis Wheatley, where on the back cover we read, Phyllis Wheatley wrote herself to freedom. That's not entirely true. In fact, even when she published her first volume of poems, she still was kept in bondage for a few more years. But also notice that she could only be published in English, of course. The literacy that she brought with her, and I should also mention here that there are actually quite a few slave narratives that survive in Arabic, right? So she would not even have been the only one to arrive already literate as an enslaved person in the United States. But the symbolical significance of the passage, I would say, is that literacy itself did nothing for Phyllis Wheatley. The literacy she already had, the literacy, the non-English literacy that she had, could only be engaged in secret, on the walls of her owner's house. Publicly exhibiting that literacy, that only could happen in English. And of course, I'm not yet saying anything about her native tongue, Fulani, which by the 18th century, I don't think had been, was written in Arabic script, but that alphabet had not been fully finalized yet. But you see how this is what I mean by the English as great emancipator myth. We have to link the learning of English to freedom, and the ideological way that that's supposed to do is that we do not have to think then about what was actually lost, not just lives and suffering and so forth, but also what was lost linguistically speaking. So I want to give you one more example. This is from a children's version, but I think it goes a long way towards explaining exactly how powerful this myth of the great emancipator is. Revolutionary poet tells the story to children of Phyllis Wheatley, and clearly has also picked up on this passage in the memoir of Margaretha Odell. The illustrator captures this scene, but of course, here she's writing English. In fact, she's writing Behold the Child is from Alexander Pope's essay on man. But this is how powerful the English as great emancipator myth is. Right? Even if we are trying to attest to this remarkable passage in the memoir, we anglicize it. Right? What in Odell is still Wheatley scribbling letters, presumably Arabic, here is fully anglicized, and therefore making sure that the myth of English as great emancipator can continue unscathed. I'm going to skip over the next author. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of my favorite Americans of all time, but for the interest of time, I'm going to close with a third example from a more contemporary poet who, like Wheatley, also seeks to attest to the linguistic loss of the Middle Passage. Now, Langston Hughes, like Du Bois, was born in the United States. Right? So he's not African-born. He grew up speaking English. And yet, and this is again what I mean by the writers that interest me most in the African-American literary canon, he felt this great longing to establish that connection with the continent of his ancestors. When he's 21 years old, he travels to Africa. He talks about this in his autobiography. There's a sort of dramatic scene as he leaves Manhattan Harbor where he tosses all of his books in the water as if he's trying to point out, I have to encounter Africa as a clean slate. Once he arrives on the west coast of Africa, he is stunned to find out that for the Africans, he's a white person. They do not see him as black. Right? So that, of course, also triggered all kinds of questions that he explores in his poetry about identity, including, and this is where I think it becomes interesting, the question of the African language. So this is from a poem. This is the last thing that I will say for the lecture because I want to give you time to ask questions too. It's fittingly entitled Afro-American Fragment. Hughes understands that it's not possible to make that broken linguistic legacy with Africa whole again. He's not naive about this. He has no qualms about that. So at best, what he can come up with is going to be fragmentary, but he feels at the same time that this is an essential piece of who he is as a poet. So then he writes, so long, so far away is Africa. Not even memories alive, save those that history books create, save those that songs beat back into the blood, beat out of blood with words sad sung, in strange, un-Negro tongue, so long, so far away is Africa. Now this is a brilliant poem that manages in just under 10 lines to precisely do what would get us beyond these two myths. The African language, it's not a particular one, he speaks generically, but the African language that you can tell he so much feels a need to be able to connect with can only strike him, not just as a strange kind of language, but a strange un-Negro tongue. Right? This is, of course, where the pain, linguistic pain and linguistic suffering comes in. Right? You understand he wants to be able to claim those African languages as he would have encountered them when traveling to Africa as a 21-year-old. And yet he feels that he stands apart from them. They're not just strange, they seem as if they belong to a different race. So Langston Hughes is a great example, and I think in this sense is precisely revolutionary, because like Phyllis Wheatley, like Du Bois, he has found a way to somehow make, even as he's writing in English, to make that language reverberate with the linguistic losses of the past. Strange un-Negro tongue. There is such beauty and such pain and suffering in that phrase alone. Right? And it shows, indeed, as I've tried to establish, how there are some poets that are able to break through these two myths that time and again seek to capitalize on English as the great emancipator. I think I will leave it at that, but I'd be happy to entertain questions if you have any. Thank you very much. Yes, Junaid.
So I see that it is very Afro-American, but you also use that from African-American. So when were these terms developed and which one is the more prevalent?
That's a very good question, and it actually changes quite a bit across the centuries. For instance, somebody such as Du Bois, who lived a very long life from 1868 all the way into the 1960s, Du Bois, for instance, would not have been found dead identifying as black. So, for instance, that notion, in the way that now we have, Black Lives Matter, that certainly would not have had much appeal to, I think, most African American writers of the early 20th century. As for Afro-American versus African American, I'm not sure. Maybe here the point may well be that he's fragmenting Afro itself. Maybe there's sort of a typographical strategy to it. But I will say that one of the things that I always find intriguing about the way the epithet African American is used is how do we conceive of how these two terms relate to each other? Right? In poetics, we often speak about metaphorical ways and metonymical ways, and a metonymical way means that something is considered a part of something else. So when we say African American, do we say the African American is a kind of American? Or do we say which would be the metaphorical way and which would be the way that I think is closer to Langston Hughes' thinking? Are we conceiving of those as in fact two separate entities? And of course, if that's the case, then by definition, you're always already looking beyond the national boundary of the United States, right? Because then African means that which ties you back to the African continent. Natasha?
Thank you so much for this beautiful lecture.
Thank you.
As you were getting into the poetry of Langston Hughes, I started wondering if you were also thinking about the rhythms of Black music like jazz, bebop, and how that might influence Black English.
Yes, no, I think that's, of course, being a poet during the Harlem Renaissance, those are definitely valid connections. I will say, for me, I'm always interested in seeing how far do we go into, or how far does a poet go into considering the actual linguistic element. Because you're right, jazz is to talk about rhythm, is to talk about sound, but that's as of yet, of course, unspoken. And I think for Hughes, particularly that phrase, un-Negro tongue, he's talking about an actual language, which is to say, like, words have meaning. In the same way that in Du Bois, for instance, too, you see that his interest in the sorrow songs is not just with the rhythm. Something is missing from that rhythm. The original lyrics, we don't have them anymore. How do we testify to that? So I would say yes and no, depending on how far the writer explores that linguistic element. It fits into that more global world literary paradigm, or it doesn't, I would say. All the way at the back, yes?
What do you think about white people writing for African Americans? Like in white poetry, people of white writing African American poetry. What do you think about that?
Okay, first you said white people writing for African Americans, or is it white people writing like African Americans? Because I think these are two different things. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there too it probably depends on the poet that we're talking about, and also it would of course depend on why the white poet, let's say, felt that he needed to don that kind of paradigm. I mean, I don't think that it, for instance, would be an example of the poetic equivalent of blackface by necessity. It could be that if indeed a white person falls trapped to all the stereotypes and perpetuates those stereotypes, yes, then it also would not be great poetry. But I can imagine, and I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, it's not so. See, I'll give this as an example. It's not really what you're talking about, because he is not trying to emulate an African American style of writing, but Richard Powers, who's a white author that I consider actually to be one of our greatest living American writers, he can do anything, right? I mean, he's written beautifully about science, about music. He has a 2003 novel, The Time of Our Singing. Actually, those of you who are in music like Natasha, you may know of it, in which he tells the story. It's a family that's racially mixed. Father is a Jewish Holocaust refugee. The mother is black. They have 3 children that exhibit extraordinary musical talent. And the novel is all set in the civil rights era. And
although of course, and Powers is not naive about this, does this with great care, but it always struck me as such a courageous act, because he's able to write about, I mean, and neither is he Jewish for that matter, he's able to write with such great insight and also very cautiously about a racial heritage that is not his. But of course, a fiction writer always writes about characters that are not necessarily his either. And it's a very long book, and to me, he actually manages to pull that off. And I know that the book has gotten great critical acclaim, among other things. So I would say, I would be the last person, I think, to also discourage any white writer from trying to undertake that. I think very often today, unfortunately, there is a sort of cancel culture penchant that says, oh, well, you are white, you should do such and such, but you cannot do that. I mean, the arts are free, of course, but one needs to be aware if one tackles something quite so heavy, weighty as racial heritage. I mean, you want to tread carefully. You want to make sure that you fully understand it. But it's possible, as I think the time of our singing that novel indicates. Thank you. Yes, Jen.
Thank you, Birger. A really important talk. I'm curious how you see the work that you're trying to do to situate African American writing within this broader context of world literature, between something like Boyce's idea of Pan-African perspective, and also sort of writing against a kind of American exceptionalist kind of narrative. How would you characterize your own project?
Well, in the larger book, I can maybe contextualize it this way. In the larger book, this is one chapter. So it's, and of course I need time to unpack the very specific historical circumstances of the Middle Passage and all of that. But at the same time, I also would argue that this reflection on linguistic insufficiency, for lack of a better term, when it comes to mourning the losses of the past, is by no means exclusive to American literature, to African American literature. I see that, for instance, in some of what Sylvia Plath does in those beautiful and very evocative elegies for her father, and the need to reach out to German, which would have been the native tongue of the father. That's a very different kind of context, but at the same time, it asks similar questions about what is the role of language in the mourning process, which is also, actually speaking of psychoanalysis, which is also stunningly not a question that has been dealt with as much as one would think. I mean, people talk about trauma and the unrepresentable, yes, but that's a generic approach. Right? Is it easier to mourn if for those who have multiple languages, is it easier to mourn in German than in English? What's the difference? What's the role that the language plays there, really? So I see that in Sylvia Plath. I see it also, I mean, and it's not even the case that this is confined to those who or their parents came as immigrants. I see that in Willa Cather too. Some of what Willa Cather does in My Antonia with the language there is also of a par with some of the questions that I talked about here. Does that make sense? Thank you for your great questions. It's always a good sign when you get questions. Okay, if there are no further questions, thank you very much for coming.